promoted. For too long, we have been the last hired and the first fired. That has to change. You may know this, but Canoes helped raise the issue of the John Williams shooting directly to Seattle City Council members Bruce Harrell and Tim Burgess, as well as the Mayor Michael McGinn. We presented a work plan based on the RSJI's 5 best practices. As Native Americans like you, we couldn't just stand by and watch this tragedy unfold. We wanted to be proactive and to come up with viable solutions around this shooting. As you know, the shooting doesn't just affect the Native American community, it affects all communities in Seattle. The John T. Williams shooting was just the last case in a string of incidents involving the police and other people of color. The Seattle Police Department will have to change their training, policies, and procedures, so we asked the police department to look at how they police through a racial lens. Canoes started by collaborating with the Seattle Office for Civil Rights and the city and other city ethnic affinity groups such as Latino City Employees, LCE, the African American Affinity Group, the Filipino American Civic Employees, otherwise known as FACES, as well as interested and concerned city employees and community members who have a history of dismantling institutional racism. We took a few of the RSJI practices, such as collaboration and assessment, and asked the Chief of Police, the Deputy Chief, and the captains in charge of training and community to sit down with us and talk about how the RSJI will reduce and increase public safety. So far, they've responded by agreeing to institute a new RSJ training for its officers and to do so by starting at the top with the chief, the deputy, the chief and captains, and the new mayor and his staff. They have all agreed to take the training as well. We are not stopping there. We are fighting for a serious Native American cultural component, a community orientation, sit-downs with elders and youth, and a review of current use of force and de-escalation policies and practices as they affect Native Americans in Seattle. We believe that the police department sits down and embraces the RSJI, that it will help increase public safety, break down barriers of fear and mistrust, and build a new generation of racial trust. I'll end with a few words about why Canoes supports changing Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day. First of all, we know Columbus could not and did not discover a hemisphere that was already inhabited by nearly 100 people. His arrival could not be considered heroic in any way to civilizations who lived here for tens of thousands of years prior to his voyage. From an Indigenous viewpoint, Columbus's arrival was a 5-star disaster from the start. Although he was initially greeted by the Taino and the Arawak Indians with a wholesome generosity and hospitality, he immediately began the enslavement and the slaughter of Indian people of the Caribbean islands. We were never the same since. Today is not a day of celebration. If anything, it should be a day of reflection and education. So that's why we're here. We're here to educate and not celebrate. As Indigenous people, we all share a common bond. We have been relegated to the margins, left without the security of real human rights, quality health care, and education. We are left here in the shadow of the colonization. Yet every October, the people of Seattle accept a holiday called Columbus Day that glorifies Christopher Columbus and the genocide of Indigenous Americans in our country. We think that should change. We're glad that the schools are still open today. That way, maybe they can teach our children the real history of Columbus' 4 ocean voyages. We must teach the history of North America in a balanced, complete, and chronological way. We must teach the effects of colonization of people on their economies, on their culture, and their environment. This is what Columbus actually wrote in 1492. They would make fine servants. With 50 men, we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want. 2 years later, half of the 250,000 Indians on Haiti were dead. By the year 1510, there were perhaps 50,000 Indians left. By 1550, there were 500 left. By 1650, they were totally gone. We must teach that the Columbus was not a scientist or explorer, but rather was driven by profit. On the other hand, we need to teach the fact that today is not about one man, it's about many peoples. Today, we celebrate our survival, our resilience, and our power. The bottom line is that if Seattle is going to commit to social justice and human rights, then we must acknowledge the past and look to the future. Someone once said that the struggle to build America, the struggle to build a more perfect union, well, part of building that union is to make sure we build upon honesty and justice. Honesty means really taking a hard look at exactly what Columbus did. Honesty is education. That's hard sometimes. Sometimes people don't want to hear it. That's just too bad. But justice is harder, because justice means doing something about it. Justice isn't just throwing up our collective normal national arms saying, oops, are bad. It's doing something about our housing, our health care, our education, and our cultural systems. Woo! Justice is about righting the wrongs of the past. It's about making amends. And it's also about looking after our neighbors and treating everyone with dignity and respect. Respect and dignity. That means policing the streets of Seattle without prejudice and with compassion. That means doing something about all of those statistics I mentioned earlier. We're not really here for ourselves. We already know the past. We know what has to get done. We're not here for the rest of the people. Having a rally on Columbus Day is absolutely critical. It's an important way that we have to say that we as a people have to say, so that others will never forget. So that they cannot and will not forget the atrocities of the past and the true meaning of Columbus Day. Because if we can forget the past, we are doomed to repeat it. Thanks for all being here.
Online, of course. The Geneva Convention's definition of genocide, because a lot of people don't understand that what happened here was genocide by every means of the definition of the Geneva Convention. You know, people are like, oh, well, you know, Columbus happened a long time ago, and oh, we can't change the past. Yeah, that's true, but up until the 70s, and even on a different level until now, genocide is still happening. And so according to the Geneva Conventions, one aspect is killing members of the group. And I always think of, you know, those old movies of the pioneers riding their horses out on the land and, you know, getting their piece of pie for free or, you know, for nothing. And I always think of, how did they get to just piece off land so freely without any problems? And you know, in those other movies of that time too, they always, you know, talk about the Indians, the savages. Oh, you got to be careful, you got to have your guns, you got to protect your land from them, because really it was their land and they were mad because you took it from them. Right. So I always think of that when I think killing members of the group, because that's what happened. That's why people could live here. There were probably millions of people that lived on this continent. In the U.S., what we call the U.S. by our imaginary lines, at that time. And now there's less than half or less than 1% Native people in this country from 100%. You know, that's the reality. That's just a fact. Another aspect of the Geneva Convention is causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. And I always think of, well, you know, there was that whole U.S. initiative of scalping. And you know, yeah, that happened a long time ago, but people were paid for human scalps. The U.S. government paid people for human scalps. That's an interesting way to motivate people to kill the people of this land. Deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. I always think of the movement of people to reservations in this clause, because when you displace a people and they don't know how to survive on a piece of land, they will die. They don't know how to feed themselves. They don't know how to survive in those conditions. That's what happens. We all remember the Trail of Tears. That wasn't a happy relocation. This was a very murderous, sad, long walk that many people, old, young, kids, man, woman, didn't matter. So many people died. And that's a part of the Geneva Convention definition of genocide. Also, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. Not everybody really knows that even up until the 1970s, minorities were targeted for sterilization, unbeknownst to them. They'd go in for a routine checkup or something not even related to reproductive anything, and they'd come out sterilized. And in that group, Native American women were the most targeted out of the minorities. That's just a fact.
Bush did it.
And the last piece to the Geneva Convention is forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. And I always think of boarding schools, which is something the United States government funded, but never has, even to this day, admitted that that has happened. If you don't know about the boarding schools, it's not some place where the parents just sent their kids off to, you know, learn about Christianity. It's actually, they could be jailed if they did not send their children. They could be fined. And those children were subject to a motto within the boarding school, which was, kill the Indian, save the man. And that's just a fact. This is what happened. These kids were beaten, sexually and physically abused for speaking their language, for being native. Tons of children died in these boarding schools. Many people don't talk about it. Like Lonnie said, people don't talk, the people that were subject to these boarding schools don't even talk about it because it was so horrific what happened. And so by all of these guidelines, the United States did calculatively perpetrate a genocide of the native people of this land. On that note, I would like to invite Sakara to sing a song. And thank you for listening. I appreciate it. And really, we're just trying to educate. It's there's a lot of misconceptions about this day and this, you know, in Columbus and what happened in the United States as a whole. And I feel like this is the one way we can try to change something is, you know, maybe one person will change their mind about this day because they learned something of the real history of this country.